It was a Monday night in October 2023. San Francisco. A woman stepped off the curb to cross the street. She never saw the car that hit her, a human driver who struck her and kept going. The impact threw her sideways, into the next lane, directly in front of a robotaxi with no one behind the wheel. The robotaxi braked. It was too late, and then it did something no human driver would ever do. It decided the safest move was to pull over. So it drove forward, with the woman pinned underneath, dragging her roughly 20 feet before it finally stopped, one wheel resting on her leg. She survived. The company that built that car had just been handed permission weeks earlier to run around the clock across the city. It was worth tens of billions of dollars. It was supposed to be the future of one of the largest car makers on Earth. 14 months later, it was gone. And almost everyone remembers this as the night that self-driving cars failed. That is not what happened. This is the story of Cruise. Not the feature in your car, the company. A robotaxi startup that General Motors bought, believed in, and poured more money into than almost anyone had ever spent chasing a driverless future. More than $10 billion. By some later accountings, more than 12. And here is the part that gets told wrong. When Cruise collapsed, the headlines wrote its obituary as a verdict on the whole idea. See, the robots can't do it, the technology doesn't work. But that story has a problem. Because at the exact same time Cruise was dying, a company running almost the same technology on the same streets was about to grow into the biggest driverless network in the country. So if the technology worked, what actually killed Cruise? The answer isn't a software bug. It's a story about ambition, about 20 feet of pavement, about a video, and about the moment a giant decided its own future wasn't worth the price. Stay with me, because the way this empire fell tells you exactly who's going to survive what comes next. To understand how far Cruise fell, you have to see how high it was lifted. In 2016, General Motors, the Detroit giant, more than a century old, bought a small San Francisco startup called Cruise. For a company its size, the price was almost a rounding error, around $1 billion. But the ambition was not small. GM didn't want a side project. It wanted to own the future of how people move. At the time, only a handful of companies on the planet even had permission to test driverless cars in California. Cruise was one of them. The other big one was backed by Google. And for a while, it genuinely looked like Cruise might win. The money kept coming. GM invested billions more. It brought in outside believers, SoftBank, Honda, Walmart, and Microsoft, all writing enormous checks. Executives told investors that by 2025, Cruise would be pulling in $1 billion a year in revenue. And on paper, the dream was arriving. In August of 2023, California regulators gave Cruise the crown jewel, permission to run a paid, driverless robotaxi service across San Francisco 24 hours a day. No safety driver, real customers, real money. For one brief moment, Cruise wasn't chasing the future. It was the future. That moment lasted about 10 weeks. Cruise had a habit that made the city nervous. Where its rival moved carefully, Cruise moved fast, Silicon Valley fast. Cars that stopped dead in intersections. Cars that blocked fire trucks. A federal safety agency had already quietly opened an investigation. But nothing prepared anyone for the 2nd of October. Here is what matters, and it's a detail most people get wrong. The car that first hit the pedestrian was not the robotaxi. It was a human driver, a hit and run, who struck her and fled, launching her into the Cruise vehicle's path. The robotaxi didn't cause the crash. What it did next caused everything else. Its software misread the collision. It classified the impact as a sideswipe, the kind of thing where the safest response is to pull out of traffic and get out of the way. So that is what it did. It drove forward to clear the lane, never understanding that a human being was caught beneath it. That is the failure. Not a car that couldn't see the road. A car that couldn't understand what had just happened to a person and made a catastrophic decision with total confidence. Now, a crash like this, even a horrifying one, might not have ended a $10 billion company. Companies survive accidents. What they rarely survive is the cover-up. Because in the days after, regulators say Cruise showed them footage of the incident. And according to the California authorities, the version Cruise first shared left something out: the dragging. When the full video surfaced later, investigators treated it as a likely deliberate omission, a company editing out the worst part of its worst day. Cruise disputed this, insisting it had handed the complete footage to state and federal officials. But by then, the argument didn't matter. The trust was gone. And in this business, trust is the whole product. You are asking a city to let a machine make life and death decisions on its streets. The moment regulators believe you hid the truth, you're finished. As one San Francisco official put it, the company had lost all public trust and needed to start over. There would be no starting over. What happened next happened fast. On the 24th of October, the California DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, suspended Cruise's driverless permit. Effective immediately, the regulators didn't just cite the crash. They accused Cruise of misrepresenting how safe its cars actually were. Within days, Cruise pulled every driverless car off the road, not just in San Francisco, but nationwide. Phoenix, Austin, Houston, all of it dark. Then came the recall. 950 vehicles called back to fix the software that decided dragging a person was an acceptable maneuver. Then the people started to go. The chief executive and co-founder, Kyle Voigt, resigned. Soon after, Cruise laid off roughly 900 employees, about a quarter of the entire company. Gone. And the government wasn't done. Federal regulators fined Cruise. Prosecutors got involved. In the end, the company admitted it had filed a false report about the crash, agreed to additional penalties, and accepted responsibility in a deferred prosecution deal. 18 months earlier, Cruise was the future of General Motors. Now it was a liability with a criminal admission attached to its name. And its owner in Detroit was doing the math. In December of 2024, General Motors made it official. It would stop funding Cruise's robotaxi dream. Completely. The company that spent nearly a decade telling the world it would remake transportation quietly folded the whole operation back into itself. The robotaxi business was over. The engineers would be absorbed to work on ordinary driver assist features instead, the kind that keep your hands off the wheel on the highway, nothing more. And now we can add up the bill. Since 2016, General Motors had poured more than $10 billion into Cruise, by later, fuller counts, more than 12. In return, across its entire life, the robotaxi business brought in less than $500 million in revenue. GM had once projected $1 billion a year. It never got close. 10 to 12 billion out. Under $500 million in. For a fleet of cars that, in the end, weren't allowed to carry a single paying passenger. Even the outside believers took the hit. Microsoft alone wrote off $800 million on its Cruise investment. Gone. That is what a buried empire looks like. Not a bankruptcy, not a dramatic collapse on the news, just a giant, quietly deciding that its own future cost too much. So let's go back to the myth. The one in every headline. Self-driving cars failed. Here's the problem with that story. While Cruise was being dismantled, its old rival was exploding. The Google-born company, Waymo, kept its cars on the road. And by 2026, it wasn't running a pilot anymore. It was operating a real business across more than a dozen American cities. A fleet of thousands of driverless cars, roughly 500,000 paid rides every single week. Investors handed it $16 billion in a single round, valuing it at over $100 billion. Same era, same core technology, same city streets where Cruise once ran. One of them died. The other became the biggest robotaxi network in the country. That is the tell. Cruise didn't collapse because driverless cars don't work. It collapsed because it moved too fast, broke a city's trust in a single night, and answered its worst moment with what regulators called a hidden video. And then its owner ran out of patience for the losses. The technology survived. The company didn't. And Cruise wasn't alone in that graveyard. Argo AI, backed by Ford and Volkswagen, was simply switched off in 2022, taking a $2.7 billion write-down with it. Too simple, once a self-driving truck darling, didn't so much die as mutate, dragged through federal investigations before reinventing itself, of all things, as a Chinese AI animation studio. The driverless future is still coming. It's just being built on a pile of buried companies. And the question isn't whether it arrives. The question is who's still standing when it does. General Motors spent more than $10 billion to own tomorrow and walked away with nothing but a driver assist feature and a very expensive lesson. Waymo spent more and kept going. Tesla is betting everything on a different approach entirely. Only one kind of company survives this race. Not the one that moves fastest. Not even the one with the deepest pockets. The one that never gives a city a reason to stop trusting it. Cruise forgot that for about 20 feet. And somewhere out there right now, a fleet of driverless cars is learning the same city streets. Billions of dollars are riding on them. The only thing we don't know yet is which empire falls next.